Okay, so we are in part 3 of our First Samuel series. We are going to be in chapters 8 to 15 today, so we got a lot of chapters to cover. All right, so let's jump in. Okay, so I don't know if you've ever heard of something called the scarcity mindset. It's an idea, it's a way of thinking that focuses on something that you think you don't have enough of. Often it's money or time, but it could be anything. When you have a scarcity mindset, you are overwhelmed with what you don't have, and it affects how you live. So basically, you end up using up your mental bandwidth and you can't see anything else. Right? So an example would be this, and if your scarcity mindset is with money, which is very popular. Okay, you have a good and well-paying career, but you save and save and save. You never spend on anything except for the bare essentials, necessities, and you struggle being generous, whether it's to others or even for yourself or your family, because you're always worried that you don't have enough. You're always worried that there's going to be some financial crisis that's going to pop up and that you're going to need all the savings just to get by. Okay, so that's like an example of someone with a scarcity mindset, and they just worry about if they have enough money or not. Right? The opposite to the scarcity mindset is the abundance mindset. Now, this isn't being irresponsible and believing that you're always going to have, and so you're just going to spend. That is not what the abundance mindset is. But what it is seeing opportunities and possibilities, and that if you miss those opportunities and possibilities, you actually might miss out on something even better, right? And so the abundance mindset is just thinking, hey, things are going to be okay. We have incredible opportunities and possibilities in life, and that it's okay to take some risks because you believe that it'll work out, right? And now, and the key here is that there's a belief that there is enough of something, whatever that is, whether time or money, and that the reward of taking that bold step is worth the cost and risk. So that's the abundance mindset. That's like the opposite of the scarcity mindset. Now, obviously, if you abuse both of those, it can be bad, right? But I think it's pretty clear that it is healthier to have an abundance mindset, and that the scarcity mindset can really affect you. Actually, the scarcity mindset can really be damaging on an individual level, but it also can manifest itself on a community level. I'll give an example with like a church level, or even on a national level of a nation, right? A church with a scarcity mindset might save and have a lot of this huge reserve, and then never spend it because it's worried that, hey, we might need it in the future, and it might miss incredible opportunities to minister to others, to bless others, to launch ministries, to support missionaries or whatever. It misses those opportunities because it has this scarcity mindset that it might not have enough for the church itself, right? A country might fear that there aren't enough jobs and wealth for everyone. And so it starts to have a us versus them mentality. And it leads to cruelty, all for the sake of national security, right? It might just believe that, hey, if we help X group of people, it must mean that we'll have less, right? That's the scarcity mentality on a national level, right? It's if we help these people, we will have less and we will be at a disadvantage. And so therefore, we got to take care of ourselves, gets a little bit isolationist, and that's what the scarcity mentality looks like on a national level. And so what's at the core of this scarcity mindset? The answer is fear. At the root of the scarcity mindset is fear. And so today in the Bible, we're in chapters 8 to 15 of 1 Samuel, and we are going to take a look at the rise and fall of King Saul. And we're going to see how fear leads King Saul down a terrible path, and it takes down his kingship, and it takes down the Israelites. But that's a lot of chapters. So let me give you a quick overview of chapters 8 to 15, and then we're going to kind of focus in on Saul himself. Okay. So we've already gone through chapters 1 to 13, so some of it overlaps. 2 weeks ago, we focused in on chapters 8, 9, and 12, but that was really focusing on Samuel. So today it overlaps, but we're going to be focusing on Saul a little bit. And so in chapters 8 to 11, I call it the Saul, Rookie King of the Year, right? And here's what happens, because Saul starts off really well, right? Chapter 8, the Israelites ask for a king. God and Samuel say, hey, this is a bad idea because God is your king. But the people say, no, we want a king. There we go. And then in chapter 9 to 11, Samuel anoints Saul. So after the Israelites demand that they have a king, God's like, okay. And Samuel anoints Saul. And Saul is made king. And he starts off well, right? The city of Jabesh is attacked, and Saul rescues them. And then Saul is confirmed as king, which basically just means that everyone's on board, right? Because Samuel anoints Saul, this is not the age of, like TV cameras and that kind of stuff. So the word doesn't always get out, and so people don't know. But when this happens, everyone's agreeing, Saul is our king, he is confirmed. And then we get to chapter 12, that's Samuel's farewell speech. We did that 2 weeks ago, and we focused on that, and that's such an important verse in chapter 12, verse 22. For the sake of his great name, the Lord will not reject his people, because the Lord was pleased to make you his own. Oh, that idea of it doesn't matter who you are, what you've done, how you've messed up. The Lord is pleased to make you his own. And we talked about, just think about that. Do you believe that God is pleased to make you his own? And so that's chapter 12. Chapter 13 is Saul's blunder. And here we see that, okay, so Saul had this victory, things are going well. It actually doesn't, right? Things get worse. The Israelites are besieged by the Philistines, and it was getting bad. In verse 6, we see this. When the Israelites saw that their situation was critical, they hid in caves and thickets, among the rocks, and in pits and cisterns. I mean, they're hiding, right? And then we find out that Saul's troops were starting to lose hope and flee. See that in verse 7 to 8. Saul remained at Gilgal, and all the troops with him were quaking with fear. See that fear theme? He waited 7 days, the time set by Samuel, but Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and Saul's men began to scatter. So instead of waiting for Samuel, who was supposed to come and do an offering before the battle, Saul gets nervous. Samuel's not here. So he goes and does the offering himself, which is a big no-no, because that is not what the king does. That is Samuel's role. And so in verse 9 to 12, it says, so he said, bring me the burnt offering and the fellowship offerings. And Saul offered up the burnt offering. Samuel arrived. What have you done? Asked Samuel. Saul replied, when I saw that the men were scattering and that you did not come, right? That's that fear we see in verse 12. I thought, I have not sought the Lord's favor, so I felt compelled to offer the burnt offering. For Saul, God was a means to an end. Right? God was not somebody to be worshipped. It was, God is here to help me get victory. And so I think the question is, why do you seek God? Saul wanted to seek God because he wanted victory. It was his own goals. Right? Do you seek God because you are trying to achieve your goals? Or do you seek God because God is worthy and that you want to have that relationship with God? That is a question we have to ask ourselves today, because for Saul, it was never about God being worthy and sovereign or a relationship with God. It was just about what God can do for him. And so things really start going downhill from there. The Philistines are now, they're not like governing the Israelites, but they've oppressed them, they rule over them. And it gets so bad that the Philistines don't allow the Israelites to have blacksmiths, because blacksmiths can make weapons. And so the Israelites, when they needed to get their farming tools serviced, like sharpened, whatever, they actually had to go to the Philistines to do it. Right? That's how bad it got, where they couldn't even have blacksmiths. And so in chapter 14, we get to a really weird one. Right? It's Jonathan and the honey of doom. Right? This is a really weird story here, and it just illustrates how, as things are unraveling, like Saul gets really dysfunctional and kind of odd in his leadership, and this is coming out of fear. Okay, and so Jonathan, who's Saul's son, he leads this two-man attack against a Philistine outpost, right? Because they're not winning, so he does this thing, he does this attack, and it works, right? The Philistines go into a panic because they're like, "Whoa, what's happening? We're being attacked. We haven't been attacked for a while." And it kind of rallies the Israelites. The Israelites are seeing what Jonathan has done. It's giving them courage, and so they go and they kind of like just they're ready to fight again. They're ready to stand up for their nation. And Saul leads the Israelites into more battles, but he does this interesting thing. He puts everyone under an oath. Right? And in verse 24 it says, Saul had bound the people under an oath, saying, "Cursed be anyone who eats food before evening comes, before I have avenged myself on my enemies." So none of the troops tasted food. Right? So they're in this battle, and it's fighting, it's going on, and Saul just tells them, "Hey, no one's going to eat until we finish this battle." The problem is that Jonathan wasn't there to hear it. And he got hungry, right? Hey, fighting makes you hungry. And so he finds wild honey somewhere. And so he's thinking, "Hey, I like honey. I'm hungry." And he eats it, not knowing that Saul, his father, has made this oath for everyone. And so Saul finds out, and he wants to make good on his oath, and he wants to kill Jonathan. And that is just messed up, right? And then, but remember, we've seen this before, right? Where people make these rash oaths. And again, we find out you don't have to keep your oath. There's a way out, right? You can make an offering when you make an oath that you're like, "Oh, I shouldn't have done that," right? Oaths are important. Saul understood that, but he did not understand the rest of God's teaching on oaths, that if you make one that's a little bit rash, you can make an offering to kind of get out of it, right? And that's much better than killing your son. Right? But Saul he's just operating on fear. He doesn't know the Lord. He doesn't know God's law, and so things are getting real dysfunctional. But of course, but he doesn't kill Jonathan because it's crazy, right? The troops come and defend Jonathan. They basically are like, "Hey, Jonathan started this rally. This started the battle that got us all together. You can't kill him. He's a hero." And so Saul backs down. He doesn't do it. Right? And the whole point of this whole chapter really is to show how things are starting to fall apart. And we really see this in the last verse, in verse 52 in chapter 14. And it says this: "All the days of Saul, there was bitter war with the Philistines. And whenever Saul saw a mighty or brave man, he took him into his service." Right? It's just like the time of Saul was bitter. And so now we get to chapter 15. This is kind of where we're going through. Chapter 15 is Saul's second blunder. This is the one that really tanks him. This is the last straw here, right? So what happens is God, even though he's a mess, he's not obeying the Lord, he's not following God, he doesn't know God, even though that's happening, God gives Saul victory over the Amalekites, but gives him special instruction not to keep any of the spoils of war. Right? And the reason is this. The Amalekites have a long and violent history with the Israelites. They are descended from Esau. They were actually the first group to attack the Israelites as they came out of Egypt. Right? So remember, they came out of Egypt and they were kind of going through land. They were like, hey, we're just passing through. The Amalekites were the first ones to attack them. And over time, you just see the Amalekites are always just very violent against the Israelites. And eventually, at some point in the past, God had said that he's going to wipe them out. And now you might sit there and think, whoa, wipe them out? That's kind of harsh. But you got to remember a couple things, right? First of all, is that the Israelites are God's chosen people. Right? This is God's special people that he's setting apart for a very specific purpose. Right? And so God's going to be very protective of his chosen people. Okay? And so for the Amalekites to continually, year after year, just be so antagonistic and violent against the Israelites, that's gonna have consequences, right? Those are God's people. The second thing is God waited a long time, right? When God said that he's going to wipe out the Amalekites, it wasn't the other day, it was many years ago. And so the Amalekites actually had a long time to change their ways and repent and turn away from basically trying to kill the Israelites all the time. Okay? So God waited a long time. And the last thing we got to remember is that ultimately God is sovereign. Right? God is sovereign over everyone and everything. Okay, but that's just like a little tidbit about the Amalekites. Okay, so God gives Saul victory over them, but Saul does not obey those special instructions. Saul does not obey again. This is just a theme we see in his life. Right? And so Samuel comes and confronts Saul, and Saul tries to justify. In verse 15, Saul says, "They spared the best of the sheep and cattle to sacrifice to the Lord your God, but we totally destroyed the rest." I can just hear that, right? And now a couple of key words there. They spared the Lord your God. Saul is he's not taking on his responsibility as the king, right? And they did it, not me. And it's your God, Samuel. That is really telling. The Lord your God. This shows where Saul's heart is when it comes to who God is. And then in verse 20 and 21, he says this again, right? He says, "But I did obey the Lord. I completely destroyed the Amalekites and brought back Agag, their king. The soldiers took sheep and cattle from the plunder, the best of what was devoted to God, in order to sacrifice them to the Lord your God at Gilgal." Again, it's the soldiers did this, not me who is in command. And it's, again, the Lord your God. And then Samuel has this famous response, and this is really where I want, this is an important one, right? He says in verse 22-23, "Does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as in obeying the Lord? To obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed is better than the fat of rams. For rebellion is like the sin of divination, and arrogance like the evil of idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you as king." To obey is better than sacrifice. that word obedience, oh, it's especially for Americans and people, in the West. Oh, it's just it doesn't sit well with us. We really just hate that word. But obedience is at the heart of our faith. It's at the heart of our relationship with God. Now, I just want to pause here because I know a lot of time when we hear this, and we all know, I know, Lord, I have not obeyed. And we start to feel ashamed. No, this is not meant to make us feel ashamed. Remember what Samuel said earlier. The Lord God is pleased to make you his own. Okay? So in this obey is better than the sacrifice, and we know we don't obey, you have to remember, God knows that about you. God has seen it before. He knows what's coming in the future. He knows our heart. He knows our weaknesses, and he's still saying, God is pleased to make you his own, right? And so as we talk about how, to obey is better than sacrifice, it's not meant for us to feel ashamed. It's really pointing to our hearts and how what's in our hearts, that's what's important. The question is, in our hearts, do we treat God transactionally? Like he's some powerful deal maker, right? Do we have this way of thinking in our hearts? What do I do? What do I need to do to get God to do blank? Right? Is that what's really in our hearts when we approach God? That we look at God and say, okay, I want this. So God, what do I need to do so you're going to do that to get me this? Right? That's a very transactional relationship with God. And that is not what God wants. That is not what it's about. And that's what Saul is about, right? Saul is showing throughout his actions that that's kind of how he's thinking. Okay, I got to obey God because if I obey God, God will do this. And he does a poor job at it. He just looks at it like what can I get out of God? And when things aren't going well, hey, Samuel, he's your God. Right? That really shows his heart. And that's what this is all about. It's about examining our hearts and seeing, where's our motivation? Is it just so God can do stuff for us? Right? Do we love God simply because God is worthy? And do we love God because he is pleased to make us his own? Right? Do we look at that and say, wow, God, you are pleased to make us your own? That love for us and that faithfulness to us, that is why I obey. Not, God, you're gonna do something for me. And so for us today, the question is, what's the root problem here? Right? What's at the heart of Saul's impatience, right? Not waiting for Samuel to come to do the offerings. What's at the heart of Samuel's greed that he's going to save the best of the spoils of war, and which leads to disobedience? What's at the heart of that? Right? Again, the answer is fear. Just like we started this with that scarcity mentality, at the heart of it is fear. Saul thought he was scarce on time, so he made the burnt and fellowship offerings himself. Saul thought he was scarce on treasure, so he kept the spoils of war. And that fear, that thinking he's scarce on things, that leads to a disobedience. Our bad decisions are always rooted in fear. If you ever reflect on the things you do that you are not proud of, always, the very, very root of it, it's always fear. And so the question we have to ask ourselves is this: is God enough? If we're fearful, ask yourself, is God enough? Now, you might sit there and say, well, yeah, I know the answer is yes, okay? That's not the point. But the question really is, do you really believe it? Do you really believe God is enough? Because if you don't really believe it, if you might say, oh yeah, God is enough, you sing the songs, but if you don't really believe in your heart, you'll live with a scarcity mentality. Because that's what makes sense. If God isn't enough, then there probably isn't enough, and I've got to make sure I have enough, right? And so if you don't really believe God is enough, you'll live with a scarcity mentality. But if you do, if you know that one truth, that God is enough, you'll be able to live in the abundance mentality mindset. You'll be able to, and I'm going to quote this song for King and Country called "Fix My Eyes." If you really believe God is enough, you'll be able to love like I'm not scared, give when it's not fair, live life for another, take time for a brother, fight for the weak ones, speak out for freedom, find faith in the battle, stand tall but above it all. Like the title of the song, Fix My Eyes, we can have an abundance mindset and live without fear when we fix our eyes on Jesus. Saul, very early on in his kingship, took his eyes off God and focused on his own abilities, focused on his enemies, and that fear led him to disobedience and led him to losing his kingdom. For us today, we got to ask ourselves the same thing. Is God enough? The answer is yes, and we have to fix our eyes on Jesus. Let's pray.